The annual Virtual Rainbow brings together LGBTQ+ youth and their families, healthcare providers, community members, and other professionals to learn about and celebrate diversity and inclusion. Thank you for joining, everyone, and welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next session. We're going to be talking with Shawn Reagor about LGBTQ issues and the updates from the 2021 Montana Legislature. And Shawn and I were just chatting, and he has a lot to tell us. So this is going to be a fantastic session for us. Just a little bit about Shawn. He is the Director of Equality and Economic Justice with the Montana Human Rights Network, and he's been an advocate for LGBTQ rights for over a decade. During that time, Shawn co-chaired the committee responsible for defeating the anti-trans bathroom initiative and worked to defeat a similar proposition in Alaska. He has presented at hundreds of educational events across the state and has worked on both the state and municipal levels to extend non-discrimination protections to LGBTQ Montanans. Shawn has created and facilitated transgender, non-binary, and two-spirit support groups across the state and helped found Transvisible. And you can read a lot more about Shawn on our website. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Shawn.
Great. Thanks for that introduction.
You're welcome.
So I think that we're just going to start out a little bit today going over some basics behind the legislative process so that we're all on the same page and it makes sense about where things are in the process and the information that I'm going to share. So let me pull up this presentation real quick. Okay, here it is, our 2021 LGBTQ legislative update. So let's talk a little bit about background. Why is LGBTQ legislation important and where are we at? And I think we all kind of know that what's happening in the Montana legislature isn't very good right now. So we'll talk about what got us into this mess. Why does legislation and policy matter? First and foremost, it has the primary impact of the policy itself. So when we talk about legislation like an anti-trans bathroom bill, there is the policy itself, which prevents people from using a bathroom that they should be able to access. In addition to that, there are the social effects and misinformation that comes from moving a bad policy forward. On the flip side, if you move a positive policy forward, then you also have an opportunity to be able to put out good information about why the policy is necessary. When I talk about social effects and misinformation, for example, when we talk about, I use the example of anti-trans bathroom bills. An example of the social effects and misinformation on that is the increased likelihood of trans people being told that they shouldn't be able to access bathrooms, and the misinformation that is associated with that is information like trans people are out to hurt other people in the community, which we know is not true. And finally, there's the impact and well-being of the affected community members themselves. So continuing on with this anti-trans bathroom example, the impact on community members is that it makes them feel unsafe, it makes them feel afraid to use the bathroom in public spaces, and it makes them feel unwelcome in the community itself. So when we think about how we respond to negative policies, it's important to think about all the aspects of these things happening. So not only is it important to try and prevent the legislation from passing, but it's also important to think about things like, how do you counter the misinformation? It's important to do things like work with the press. And it's also important to make sure that community members aren't just being used for their stories or put in vulnerable positions. So, for example, when we talk about the impact of the policy itself, obviously we work to prevent the policy from going into effect, or if it does go into effect, we work to overturn the policy or water down the implications that it has. In terms of social effects and misinformation, we really work to provide good information, training opportunities, and working with the press and community to tell our stories. One thing that we really found that is really important when countering anti-LGBTQ legislation is for the affected people to be out front and to be able to make the decisions about the policy and how it's countered. And it's also really important for those people to be able to tell their stories in whatever way feels empowering for them. And then when we think about how to counter the impact and well-being of affected community members, we think about things like building community, having decompression sessions, having support groups, and really turning people out and being able to counter some of the bad messages that our opposition pushes forward with these pieces of legislation. So there are a lot of different types of policies and laws. Just real briefly, I'll go through some of them. There are legislative laws. Those are things like a statewide non-discrimination protection that would go through a legislative process. There are things called referendums, and these start in the legislature, but instead of going to the governor to be signed into law, they end up going onto the ballot for people to vote on. There's a number of different reasons that referendums go through this process. It's not particularly common, but usually there's one or two every ballot cycle. And these referendums, for example, sometimes will go through this process to avoid going to the governor, so the governor doesn't have an opportunity to veto it. Similarly, but different, are ballot initiatives. Ballot initiatives or citizens initiatives are where a group of people get together and say, we think that this is really important, that this goes into law, and we want to put it on the ballot for people to vote for. So like a referendum, people are voting on it on a ballot. That means all of us are voting on it on our ballots when we vote. But unlike referendums, they go through a ballot process, through a citizens process, where, for example, they go out and collect signatures, and you have to have so many signatures from so many different counties to be able to get it on the ballot. In addition, there is state administrative rulemaking. Now, usually state administrative rulemaking is pretty boring and happens every day, and we don't think anything about it. But sometimes there is an interesting piece of rulemaking or something that gets people's attention. And then finally, there is municipal rules. So these are things that the county or the city will pass and just affect that county or city. For example, an example of a municipal rule is if the city of Missoula decided that they wanted to pass an ordinance that put a tax on plastic bags or something like that, or ban plastic bags. And then finally, the last piece of how policy and law can be affected is through the court process. Now, the courts interpret the laws, and oftentimes things go to court when there's a conflict between two different laws. So some different examples of these. When we talk about legislative laws, I mentioned statewide protections for non-discrimination rules. When we talk about referendums, actually the very first iteration Montana saw of an anti-trans bathroom bill was a referendum. So that means that if the legislature would have passed that anti-trans bathroom bill, it would have gone to then Governor Bullock. Instead of going to then Governor Bullock to sign, it would go on to the ballot for everyone to vote on whether or not it went into law. After that bill failed, it was brought back as a ballot initiative to try and get it on the ballot. And thanks to the work of a number of phenomenal organizations in the state, that ballot initiative didn't even qualify to get on the ballot. They were not able to collect enough signatures. An example of state administrative rulemaking is something that happened back in 2017, and that was an update to how people are able to update their birth certificates. So previously in the state of Montana, to update the gender marker on your birth certificate, that means like the M or F on the birth certificate, you had to have surgery, have a letter from your physician, and then go to court to prove that you had surgery to be able to update your birth certificate. Now, there's a number of reasons that this is bad. First of all, it's out of date. It was written in the 70s. But in addition to that, we know that a lot of trans people don't have or don't want surgery for a number of different reasons. As I mentioned, some folks don't feel like it's necessary for them to have surgery to be who they are. In addition to that, surgery can be hard to access, and some people aren't able to get surgery even if they want it. And then on top of that, it's a long, lengthy process that isn't necessary. To update the gender marker on your passport or your driver's license or your social security, you're not required to go to court or to have surgery. So requiring this in the state of Montana for one form of identification, but not all the others, creates an issue where some people have birth certificates that don't match their other forms of identification. So in 2017, we worked with the Department of Health and Human Services to update the law with the department to update the rule with the Department of Vital Statistics to make it easier for people to update the gender marker on their birth certificate. Now, the process then removed the requirement for people to have surgery and to go to court, which was a great change. There was one little snag in that that I'm going to just take a little bit of a tangent to explain real quick because it will come up later. In 2017, there was a budget crisis and a shortfall because there had been significant fires and the amount of tax money coming into the state was less than expected. So it triggered a special legislative session. So it was 4 days of legislators coming into the Capitol building to discuss how they would address and fix the budget deficit. What happened during that process is someone had found out about this rule change and said, we don't want this to happen. So what the legislature actually tried to do, pass a bill, was called Senate Bill 10, that would prevent this rule change from going into effect. What ended up happening was we were able to prevent that bill from passing and going into effect. So the birth certificate update did go into effect. We'll talk more about this birth certificate rule later because it's related to one of the bills that we have in the legislature right now. So that's an example of an administrative rule. Another example of an administrative rule is like when Governor Bullock made the rule that the state of Montana in its hiring practices cannot allow any discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, and they cannot contract with anyone who does discriminate based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So the next piece that we talked about is municipal rules, and these are things like non-discrimination ordinances. A great example of this is the cities of Missoula, Bozeman, Helena, Butte, and Whitefish all have non-discrimination protections that say if you live or work in those cities, you cannot be discriminated against in housing, employment, and public services based on your sexual orientation or gender identity. And then finally, the last piece is the courts piece. Now, there are a lot of different ways that courts can affect state and federal law and the implementation of those laws. One of the best ways that we use the courts is to overturn bad rules. So, for example, there was a law in the books that was sexual deviancy laws that basically made it illegal to be gay. And 2 decades ago, the state of Montana overturned that law and said that it invaded privacy and that it was illegal and unconstitutional. That was Montana v. Grayson. Now, there have been other rulings recently that also impact things. For example, many of you have probably heard of the Bostock case, which was national legislation that, it wasn't legislation. It was a federal court ruling that said that gender identity and sexual orientation are protected under gender discrimination, so under a specific title of existing law. And then we had a similar ruling in the state of Montana in the Maloney case. So one other thing that's important to know is that we see policies and politics and cultural swings a lot. So for example, after there was federal marriage recognition from the Supreme Court, there was a massive pushback against that. And the target of that legislation was the trans community. And we saw that massive pushback come in the form of anti-trans bathroom bills. And we see this both on the national level, and then we also see this on the state level. So an example of seeing this on the state level is actually in North Carolina. It wasn't just an anti-trans bathroom bill that they had brought forward, but another piece of that information, or another piece of that policy, was to overturn a city non-discrimination policy or non-discrimination ordinance that had been enacted. And so they called a special session and pushed forward House Bill 2, which both overturned the city non-discrimination protections, and then in addition to that, push this anti-trans bathroom bill forward. So it's very common to see both political and cultural pushback after big wins. Well, if you think about it, we have gained big wins recently, both in the state and out of state, with the Bostock and Maloney rulings. So it wasn't a surprise, and everyone was expecting that we would see pushback in the state and across the country in terms of these rulings. Oftentimes what they push against and what they target are pieces where people have the least familiarity. So for example, trans bathrooms made a great target because people have a general discomfort of bathrooms to begin with. And then in addition to that, because of a lot of factors, people are less familiar with trans people, so it makes them easier targets. Another big factor that impacted where we're at right now, and all of the bad legislation that we're seeing in the state of Montana, is the 2020 election results. Not only did Republicans win every statewide seat but they also picked up 9 seats in the House of Representatives and 1 seat in the Senate, which means that to be able to stop a bad bill, we need 17 Republicans and every Democrat to vote with us to be able to stop a bad bill. And to be able to move a bad bill through, to move a good bill through in the House of Representatives, we need 18 Republicans to vote with us and all Democrats to vote with us. On the flip side, in the Senate, we need 6 Republicans to vote with us and all of our Democrats to be able to stop bad legislation, and we need 7 Republicans to be able to move good legislation. So it was a massive swing and really stacked the deck against us. In addition to that, not only were more Republicans being elected, but a number of people had been reelected or elected for the first time that are much less moderate and significantly more aligned with the far right. So that also encouraged a lot of bad bills to be brought forward. Really, really quick, here is a map of how a bill becomes a law. First, it's introduced, then it's referred to a committee, then there is a hearing. This is where public and other individuals can weigh in. And then the committee votes. And then it goes to, if it's introduced in the House, it goes to the House floor, which means every representative in the House votes on it. If it passes, then there's another vote on that just to confirm the vote and the bill passes. After it passes one chamber, so if it starts in the House, then it'll go to the Senate. If it starts in the Senate, then it'll go to the House, and it'll go through the entire process all over again. After it passes both chambers, then it goes to the governor, who can either veto it or sign it into law. One little note is that throughout this process, there are several opportunities where amendments to the bill or alterations to the bill can be made. And it's important to know that if a bill is amended in one house, in one chamber, it also has to be voted for, that amended version, in the other chamber. So, for example, what happened with one of our bills that we'll talk about a little bit later is it passed the House, but then was amended in the Senate. So then it needed to go back to the House to have that altered version confirmed. However, just recently, the House voted against the altered version, which then sends it to what's called a conference committee. And that's where representatives of both the House and the Senate get together and vote and talk about what the entire bill should look like. And then it goes to one chamber, the other, or both to be voted on before it goes to the governor. If something happens in that conference committee where the House and the Senate cannot agree on a compromise, there's a chance that that bill will be killed. Okay, so that brings us up to January 2021, the start of the legislative session. Almost. Actually, one quick thing to note before we start talking about what happened this session is that one thing that is great about the state of Montana and our legislative processes is that you can find out immediately when someone requests a bill to start in the draft process. So going back to this map, before anything is even introduced into the House or introduced into the Senate, it has to be drafted. And that process goes through a number of different steps. The first of which is that a legislator sends a request to the Legislative Services Division to say, I want a legislative bill drafted, and this is the title of the bill, and they'll provide more information. Because we have really good transparency laws in the state of Montana, we can actually get a little bit of information about the bills that have already been drafted or requested ahead of the legislative session. So going into the legislative session, we were actually tracking 10 anti-LGBTQ bills. Some of them are very similar or what we are seeing today, and some of them are quite different. There is a deadline for bills to be requested or drafted. That deadline doesn't actually happen until a couple months into the legislative session. So there's a lot of time for things to be brought up. It's also important to know that not every draft is actually introduced and voted on. So, what bills were actually introduced? First and foremost is HB 112. This bill and the next one we're about to talk about are the first two bills that we saw, and they were actually drafted. The draft was requested all the way back in August of 2020. So this trans sports ban isn't something that's new. It has been brought up in Idaho, and we've seen across the country, there has been, I think, 26 different states that have proposed similar legislation. Now, the version in Montana is specific to trans female athletes. And what it says is it requires sports teams to be designated either male, female, or co-ed, and any female sports team can only have biologically female athletes, aka female athletes who are assigned female at birth, meaning no trans athletes. It doesn't say the same thing for trans men or for male athletes. So this sports ban covers everything from kindergarten through college level athletics, and it puts the burden on the schools to enforce. Obviously, there are a lot of issues with that, but it would allow someone to say, hey, I don't think that this person that I'm competing against is cisgender, so I'm going to sue the school because they allowed her to participate in a women's sports team. It's really bad for a number of different reasons, obviously. I will also note that the title of this bill is not the trans sports ban. They call it something about protecting women's sports. I do not use the names that they use in reference to these bills for a specific reason. We don't want to continue the misinformation that the title of the bill brings forward. We know that these bills are not anything about protecting women's sports. We know that these bills are about attacking trans women and preventing trans people from being able to participate in their community and gain all of the benefits of sports. The next bill that we saw was the trans medical care ban. And this prevented anyone under the age of 18 from being able to acquire hormone blockers, hormone replacement therapy, or any type of gender affirming surgery. Now, it's important to note that those things are only banned for trans individuals. So, for example, if you had a cis woman who was 17 and wanted to have breast augmentation surgery, that would be allowable. But if you had a trans woman who wanted to do the same thing at the same age, that would be forbidden. In addition, that also has implications for things like getting treatment for ovarian issues and cysts and other healthcare related issues. So we see some real issues with this trans medical care ban. I will get back to a little bit about what happened with this trans medical care ban, but basically we were able to prevent it from passing the House floor. So it passed out of committee and went to a full vote. However, it did not pass on its vote. After it didn't pass, they brought it back with a more limited scope, so it only applied to surgery. Now, the reason that they brought it back like that is because they still wanted to pass some sort of policy attacking the rights of trans people. However, they knew that they couldn't include cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers because that was really what people had an issue with. So they brought it back with a more narrow scope. Now, it's important to know that the legislature actually broke their own rules to bring this bill back. And in fact, there is a rule that says the same legislation or the same bill or the same topic cannot be debated more than once after it's dead. However, they broke their own rules, and then they had a special rules committee that said, actually, this is okay. So the legislature can change or break any of its rules or say that we interpret this as not breaking the rules, which was what happened with HB 427 at any point, which is a little bit frustrating to a lot of us. So in addition to those three bills, we had several other pieces of legislation introduced. I will note that if you notice, some of these bills say HB and some of these bills say SB. If you're wondering about the origin of that, HB stands for House Bill, which means that it was introduced and started on the House side. SB stands for Senate Bill, which means it was introduced and started on the Senate side. Now, if you're wondering what determines where a bill starts, in the House or in the Senate, the very simple answer is if the person that introduces it and is sponsoring it is a senator, then it starts on the Senate. If they're a representative, then it starts in the House. So going back to Senate Bill 215, this is what people refer to as a RFRA, or a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. That's the name of the title, but what I like to call it is the Religious Refusal Bill. Because what this bill allows people to do is it overturns statewide non-discrimination ordinances and allows anyone to not follow any rule or law, including anti-discrimination rules or laws, by claiming that it is against their religious freedom. So someone could say, for example, I am not going to hire you, even though the city of Missoula has laws that say that I have to hire you, that I can't not hire you because of who you're married to. I am choosing not to hire you because it goes against my religious freedom. Now, this also has very broad and lasting implications for everything from healthcare to employment to housing to daily living. It has huge implications and is very problematic. An example of healthcare is someone could, for example, an ENT, when that ENT showed up on the scene and found out that the person that they were treating is trans, they could refuse to treat that person and say that treating them is a burden on their religious freedom, so they decided not to. Now, if this were actually to happen in the state of Montana, it's very likely that there would be a lawsuit and that this would go to the courts. However, that is one example of what can happen. In addition, it's important to know that a lot of the ways that non-discrimination ordinances get used are to prevent harm from happening. So for example, if you have someone who shows up to work one day and says, I'm transitioning, and their employer says, if you transition, then you will be fired, then it's possible for either them or someone who's advocating for them to come in and say, hey, just so you know, this city has non-discrimination protections, and if you were to do this, it would be illegal. So we recommend that you don't. And most of the time, those things are resolved completely out of court and without going through any sort of a legal process. Now, if this RFRA were to pass, it would overturn that. So it would interfere with a lot of the advocacy type work that we do. And it would allow someone to say, well, yes, but actually this is because of my religious freedom, so I'm not going to anyway. Finally, there's SB 280. This is the birth certificate bill. So if you remember when I was talking a lot about the birth certificate rule change at the beginning, I mentioned that during the 2017 legislative session, there was an attempt to prevent this rule change from going into effect. And it was not successful. So the rule change went into effect. Since then, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of Montanans across the state have been able to get a birth certificate that more accurately represents their gender identity. It's important to know in the state of Montana, we still do not have an option for a non-binary gender marker or a unisex or gender neutral gender marker. So the only thing that can happen is someone can change their gender marker from male to female or from female to male. However, as I mentioned, there are a lot of legislators and people in the state who did not like this rule change. They thought that people who are trans should never be able to update any of their documents, and the state making it easier was a problem. So they brought forward this birth certificate bill that would take the rule back to the 1970s, which requires people both to have surgery and to go to court. And we discussed all the reasons that that is an issue earlier. It's also important to note that part of what's important about a birth certificate is that it really affects people's safety and ability to get jobs and licensure and enroll in schools and different things like that. So having a birth certificate that accurately reflects who you are is really important. So there are a number of other LGBTQ related bills that aren't the big ones that you're probably familiar with. And I'm just kind of going to go through these a little bit faster. So there's SB 99, which is a sex ed bill. That bill would, in its original form, would require, instead of having an opt-out option for parents in public schools for sex ed for their children or guardians, would require everyone to opt in through parental consent into sex ed. It would also require the school to publish all information and materials and to inform parents of all information and materials required for sex ed. Now, that transparency process isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, it would go so far to say that if, for example, you're reading a book in English class written by someone who is LGBT or has an LGBTQ character or anything of the sort, then it would require parental consent. So that bill is actually really bad, and that piece of the bill can actually be really bad. In addition to that, it prevents healthcare providers that have abortion access from being involved in any piece of the curriculum or education process, which means organizations like Planned Parenthood or even a lot of fantastic healthcare organizations would be left out of the education process in something that they're experts in. Now, this bill was amended, and I won't get into a lot of the logistics of that, but it is still really problematic, and it does still prevent healthcare providers from being involved in the education. In addition to that, Senate Bill 298 was introduced, which is called a right of conscience bill. Now, this is specifically targeted for K through 12 public education. And basically what it means is it is a RFRA for teachers, meaning that a biology teacher who doesn't believe in evolution, even though it's part of the state's written curriculum, could refuse to teach that. Now, you may be asking yourself, what's LGBTQ related about that? Well, the flip side of this is that it could also be used in terms of sex ed curriculum, in terms of providing services for students. So for example, a school counselor could refuse to speak with an LGBTQ student, or for example, even the child of LGBTQ parents. And in addition to that, it would prevent any sort of rules or consent from parents who have, for example, a trans child in terms of name and pronouns. So a teacher could refuse to use the proper name and pronouns in reference to a student. In addition to that, there was SB 179, which was a law that would remove anyone who is incarcerated or in any piece of the Montana Department of Corrections from human rights, from the Montana Human Rights Act. So the Montana Human Rights Act is the foundation of our non-discrimination laws. It doesn't include sexual orientation or gender identity, even though that's something that we are working on and have been working on for a long time. However, it does include things like race, religion, marital status, income status, all of these different pieces of a person's identity that shouldn't be relevant to how they're treated as human beings. Now, this would remove those protections from people who are incarcerated. So this is a serious issue. In addition to that, there is another bill about parental health care and consent, and it requires parental consent in healthcare for every single piece of healthcare that anyone under the age of 18 were to receive. So, for example, this means things like being able to talk to a counselor about issues that you may have as an LGBTQ person. It has huge implications for people who are being physically or sexually assaulted, and altogether is just a bad bill. Interestingly enough, with this parental health care bill that says that parents have to be able to consent to everything that happens in terms of healthcare with anyone under the age of 18, it's the same person who ended up being in support of the trans medical care ban. So it's interesting to say that parents have to be able to consent and have the ultimate authority over everything unless their child is trans. Just a side note. There is a medical ethics bill that would allow, basically it's a RFRA for healthcare providers, which means this goes kind of back to not having to provide any sort of care to a trans or LGBTQ person. It allows for refusals, for example, for someone who provides in vitro services, if they don't want to provide those services to a queer couple, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is very problematic. I mentioned a little bit earlier about this parental rights bill, and that says that parents have the ultimate authority over their children and their rights, especially in healthcare, which I mentioned is part of the irony about this person also supporting the trans medical care ban. Finally, there's the Religion is Essential bill. And this is a bill that was originally aimed and framed to be the counter for the state being able to enact restrictions around pandemics for churches. The whole thing is framed around the state was able to shut down churches. However, places that served groceries and sold alcohol were still able to stay open. So that is not fair, and therefore religion is an essential service and the government can't regulate anything related to religion. However, that also has big implications and causes a lot of problems around LGBTQ rights, including things like this being a similar version of a religious refusal bill. Finally, there is school extracurriculars. Now, this was a bill that we were tracking right at the beginning of this session because it looked like it could be some sort of a trans sports ban, but actually this bill ended up saying that people who are homeschooled or in private schools have to be able to access and be able to participate on sports teams in public schools, even if they're not enrolled in those schools. So this is an example of one piece of legislation that we were tracking, but didn't get introduced. I'm sorry, we were tracking, was introduced, but didn't end up being LGBTQ related. So where are we at with all of these bills? So I will start with the bills that have failed. First and foremost, there's the HB 113, that's the trans medical care ban. That was defeated on the House floor during third reading. Now, it's pretty unusual for bills to pass second reading, but be overturned on third reading. So we were really excited that we were able to flip enough votes to be able to prevent that from passing. All of these bills in red, so that's the right of conscience in education, the human rights laws, the parental health care, the medical ethics, and the parental rights have all been killed. That means that they can no longer be passed. After 113, the medical care ban was passed, they brought it back as 427. Now, we're waiting to find out what will happen with 427 right now. For a little bit of background, it went through the House, it went through committee, it passed off the House floor, and then it went to the Senate. It had a committee hearing in the Senate and passed through the Senate committee onto the Senate floor. So the next piece that will happen is a vote on the Senate floor. Now, the Senate could either vote to indefinitely postpone, it could vote to pass the bill, or it could just continue to sit there until we hit the deadline for the session, meaning the end of the session, in which case it would be effectively dead. We're not sure which of those will happen, but we're paying close attention to it. In addition to that, there is Senate Bill 215, which is the RFRA. Unfortunately, this bill has passed through both the Senate and the House and has arrived on the governor's desk. And we're waiting to find out whether the governor will sign this into law or will veto it. Now, given the fact that the governor's office and the lieutenant governor came in and testified in support of this bill, we think that it's fairly likely that it will be signed into law. In addition, the birth certificate bill and the sex ed bill have both passed both chambers and are on the governor's desk about to be signed or vetoed. That is also the case with the school extracurricular bill. Senate Bill 172 and 112 are kind of in a little bit of a limbo process right now. They've passed one chamber and then they went to the second chamber and had amendments added on to the second chamber, in the second chamber. So right now they're going through kind of a little bit of a process to find out what the end result of that bill will look like. And then they will go to either the Senate, the House, or both to be voted on. If they pass through that process, then they will be transmitted to the governor's desk to be vetoed or signed into law. Okay, so that's a lot of information about where we're at right now. A lot of you are probably thinking, is this really my state? I mean, look at all of these anti-LGBTQ bills. It's not uncommon for us to see one or maybe two anti-LGBTQ bills, but it is very uncommon for us to see all of these bills in a single session. And it's easy to feel frustrated and angry and defeated and wonder why so many of these bills are coming forward now. We talked a little bit about why and some of the background earlier in the presentation. But I think that one thing is really important to know, that the trans sports ban, the trans medical care bans, the RFRA, and the birth certificate bill are all part of a larger picture, especially with the sports ban, the medical care ban, and the RFRA. These bills are being introduced in Montana, but not just introduced in Montana, they're being introduced in many, many states across the country. And this is part of a coordinated effort to attack the rights of LGBTQ and specifically trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks in the states. It's part of a national agenda. And there are national groups who are really putting forward these bills. In fact, there was an app that allowed you to put in your information and it would pop up with suggested bill language for your legislature to be able to introduce an anti-trans sports bill or an anti-trans sports ban. So it's important to know this isn't just about Montana. This is happening on the national scale. It's also important to know that a big piece of this is being affected by the 2020 election results. Having such a big majority in both the House and the Senate has affected a lot of the work that happens. And not having a Democratic governor to be able to veto this has encouraged a lot of bad behavior and a lot of bad bills. It's also important to know that this type of legislation isn't just happening with LGBTQ issues. It's happening with a lot of issues that we care about. It's happening around reproductive justice. It's happening around voting rights and access. It's happening around taxes and our income system in the state. So it's not just LGBTQ issues. However, we have never seen a legislative session like this before. The other thing that's important to know is that even though we call people that are elected in the state representatives or senators, it doesn't necessarily mean that those individuals really reflect the values of the state of Montana. For someone to run for office, they have to be able to take off 4 months every 2 years to be able to live in Helena and work the legislative session. And the idea is that that way you can get people who are everyday citizens and it's not a full-term professional job, so that people in the state are actually making the rules. However, not everyone, and in fact, a lot of people aren't able to access that process and become legislators. And a lot of people who would be great and well qualified aren't aware or aren't doing that job. So that's one piece of things that affects it. It's also important to know that we still have voting rights access issues in the state. This is especially true on tribal lands. There are big hurdles that prevent a lot of people in this state from being able to participate in our democracy fairly. So when you're asking yourself, is this really Montana and is this really what the values of the state represent right now? The answer is not entirely. There are people in the state of Montana who do support these bills, and there are people in the state of Montana who really hate these bills, and there are a lot of people who don't have enough information to have an informed opinion. Real quick, I'm going to talk about what now, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. How can you help? Volunteer and contact decision makers. Right now, something you can do today is call the governor's office and tell him to veto and stop all the anti-LGBTQ legislation. The more people that contact him, the more pressure that's on him to prevent him from passing these bills or from signing into law these bills. Share good information from the community. This is the best way to prevent misinformation and some of those negative social effects. Make sure that the information that you're sharing comes from people in the community themselves, and make sure you have the consent and permission of that person to be able to share that information, and that you give them credit. And finally, share support and make space for affected community members. There are a lot of folks who are hurting right now, and it's really important that we be able to make space for those feelings, to not tell people how they should be reacting or what their role within the movement needs to be. And it's also important for people to be able to get away from all of these things happening. It's important for people to be able to have that space. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. I will be taking some questions, and I think Deb has kind of been monitoring the chat.
Thanks, Shawn. Yeah, we have a few things in the chat. Let's see. So we have a comment from Miha, got a phone call from Montana Human Rights Network this morning, connecting me to the governor's office to leave a message. And so that's what we have in the chat right now. Feel free to go ahead and put some things in there for Shawn, or just unmute yourself and use your audio. If anybody has anything, any follow-up questions or comments.
I noticed that there's a question from Miha, why even put sex markers on
Oh.
IDs anyway? I entirely agree, Miha. There is no reason that sex markers need to exist on IDs.
Yeah.
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, I will just thank you all so much for joining. If you have any sort of questions or need any more information or are interested in volunteering, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will be putting my email in the chat, but just simply it is shawn@mhrn.org. Thanks, everyone.